It was 2 a.m., and I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling. George was snoring next to me, as usual, but my mind was racing. I couldn't stop thinking about Evelyn's shocking revelation that morning. My best friend, married for almost 2 decades like me, had casually admitted that she was cheating on her husband, Eric. She had described it as if it were nothing, something she enjoyed every Wednesday afternoon with her insurance man. I thought I knew Evelyn, but this changed everything. My heart pounded in my chest, not from anger, but from the undeniable pull of curiosity. My name is Stacy Whitfield, and I've been married to George for 16 years. I'm 39, with dark brown hair that I keep short, almost like a page boy style, and I'm often told I look younger than my age, although I feel every one of those years lately. I used to be a school teacher, but after a particularly tough year with a class full of spoiled kids, I left my job. Now I'm a suburban housewife, stuck in a monotonous routine that leaves me feeling a bit lost. George works for an oil company and travels a lot. When he's home, he's either too tired or too distracted to notice that we've drifted apart. We don't have kids, which is something I used to dream about, but it never happened. It's a sensitive topic that I don't like to talk about, even with Evelyn, who has a daughter, Agatha, who's off at university now. We meet up every week for coffee and to catch up on life. It's become a tradition ever since I stopped working. It was during one of these mornings that she dropped the bombshell. "What you need, Stacy, is a good regular shagging," Evelyn had said, her blue eyes twinkling mischievously. I stared at her, shocked. "Evelyn, that's terrible. I'm not going to cheat on George." Evelyn just laughed. "Who said anything about cheating? I'm just saying it could do some good to feel alive again. I'm speaking from experience, darling." She leaned in closer, lowering her voice as if she were about to tell me a great secret. "I'm having an affair, Stacy. And it's been amazing." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Evelyn? Having an affair? My mind raced. I had always thought of her as bold, but this was something else. When she saw my stunned expression, she continued as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "It's not a real affair," she clarified. "It's just physical. He's my insurance guy, Bill. He comes over every Wednesday afternoon, we have sex, and that's it. I'm not leaving Eric. It doesn't change anything about my marriage. In fact, things have been better with Eric since I started seeing Bill." My mouth dropped open. "You're serious?" "Completely," she said, sipping her coffee like she hadn't just turned my world upside down. "Look, life is short, Stacy. You have to do what makes you happy. Eric gets what he needs from me, and I get a little excitement on the side. No harm done." I didn't know what to say. Part of me was horrified, but another part, one I wasn't proud of, was intrigued. George and I hadn't been intimate in months. When we were, it felt more like a chore than anything else. Our marriage wasn't terrible, but it wasn't exciting either. We had settled into a comfortable routine, and somewhere along the way, the passion had just fizzled out. Listening to Evelyn describe her secret life felt like hearing about a world I hadn't even considered. "You should try it," Evelyn said, her tone playful but with a hint of seriousness. "It doesn't have to mean anything. Just think about it." I shook my head, trying to laugh it off. "I could never do that, Evelyn. I'm not like you." She smiled, that knowing smile that always made me feel like she was 10 steps ahead of me. That's what I thought too. Until I did it. That conversation replayed in my head over and over as I lay in bed that night, unable to sleep. George, oblivious, snored softly beside me. I glanced at him, feeling a pang of guilt just for entertaining the thought. But there was also something else stirring inside me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Desire. The next morning, things felt different between Evelyn and me. We still met for coffee, still chatted like old friends, but there was a new tension. I couldn't stop thinking about her words, and it must have shown on my face because she finally asked, "You're not still upset about what I told you, are you?" "No," I lied. I can't believe you're so casual about it." Evelyn shrugged. "It's not a big deal, Stacy. It's just sex." But for me, it was more than that. It felt like a betrayal, not just of Eric but of everything I thought I knew about Evelyn, about marriage, about myself. I had always seen fidelity as non-negotiable. Yet here was my best friend telling me that it didn't have to be that way, that there were other ways to find happiness. I started to wonder about my own life. Could I really go on like this, stuck in a marriage where intimacy had become a distant memory? George wasn't a bad husband. He provided for us, he was kind, but there was something missing. And it wasn't just the sex. It was the closeness, the connection. I wanted to feel wanted again, to feel alive. Evelyn's confession had opened a door in my mind that I wasn't sure I could close. I spent the next few days thinking about it, torn between my loyalty to George and my growing curiosity. I found myself looking at men differently, wondering if they saw me the way I now saw myself, as someone who could still be desired, still be attractive. One afternoon, George came home from work earlier than usual. He gave me a peck on the cheek, barely looking at me before heading to the kitchen to grab a beer. I watched him, feeling an unfamiliar distance between us. We had become like roommates, coexisting in the same space, but living separate lives. I wanted to talk to him, to tell him how I was feeling, but the words wouldn't come. It was easier to let things stay as they were. But the thoughts kept coming back, haunting me in the quiet moments when George wasn't around. Could I really do it? Could I follow Evelyn's advice and find excitement outside my marriage? The idea was terrifying and thrilling all at once. I wasn't sure what I wanted, but I knew something had to change. The days after Evelyn's confession dragged on, and my mind wouldn't settle. Everything she had told me kept running through my thoughts. It wasn't just the affair that bothered me, it was the way she talked about it, like it was the simplest thing in the world. A secret part of me envied her. Evelyn, with her tall, slender frame, her golden hair always perfectly styled, had never seemed uncertain about anything. She moved through life with such confidence, as though she had everything figured out. And now this, an affair. A secret world she had entered and thrived in, while I stayed on the outside, stuck in the same boring cycle of my marriage. I wasn't even angry at her. How could I be? If anything, I was angry at myself. Angry that I had let things get this bad with George. Angry that I couldn't be more like Evelyn, more daring, more bold. But betrayal is a strange thing. It creeps in quietly, even when you try to ignore it. Even when you tell yourself it's not something you would ever do. That's what I told myself over and over again. I could never betray George. I wasn't like Evelyn. I wouldn't have an affair, no matter how tempting the idea had become. Still, the seed had been planted, and it was growing faster than I wanted to admit. Every time George and I went through the motions of our life together, his coming home, grabbing a beer, watching TV in silence, I felt that distance between us grow. It was like we were on opposite sides of a chasm, and neither of us had the strength to build a bridge across it. One evening, after another silent dinner where George had barely said 2 words to me, I found myself on my phone, scrolling through photos of old friends on social media. That's when I saw him, Mark Thompson. We had gone to high school together, but I hadn't thought about him in years. The photo showed him smiling, standing next to a group of friends at what looked like a bar. He looked older, of course, but still handsome in that rugged, boyish way I remembered. Something in me stirred. I clicked on his profile and started scrolling through his photos, feeling a strange excitement I hadn't felt in a long time. There were pictures of him hiking, traveling, living what seemed like an adventurous, carefree life. He wasn't married, I noticed. There were no signs of a wife or children, just snapshots of him with friends, smiling, happy, free. Before I knew what I was doing, I had sent him a message. Hey Mark. Long time, no see. How have you been? I stared at the screen for a few seconds, my heart racing, before I realized what I had just done. My hand hovered over the phone, tempted to delete the message before he could see it, but before I could make up my mind, the little dots appeared, showing that he was typing a reply. Stacy. Wow, it's been ages. I'm doing great. How about you? I felt a rush of excitement as I typed back, I'm good, just living the suburban life. I added a little laughing emoji, trying to sound casual, like this was no big deal. But my heart was pounding in my chest. What was I doing? This was just an innocent message, I told myself. It didn't mean anything. We chatted for a while, catching up on each other's lives. I told him about leaving my teaching job, about my quiet life with George. He told me about his travels, his job as a freelance photographer. He had never settled down, never gotten married, just never found the right person, I guess, he had said. I could almost hear the shrug in his message. Before we said goodnight, he added, "It's been great catching up with you, Stacy. Maybe we should meet up sometime, grab a coffee." I hesitated, staring at the message. Meeting up with Mark? It sounded harmless enough, but something about it felt dangerous. I wasn't sure if I trusted myself. After all, this was exactly how Evelyn's affair had started. A simple conversation, a casual meetup, and then. But I typed back, "Sure, that sounds great. Let's set a date." A week later, I found myself sitting in a small cafe downtown, waiting for Mark to arrive. I had told George the first was meeting an old friend for coffee, which was true, but I left out the part where this old friend was someone I used to have a massive crush on back in high school. It wasn't a lie, I told myself. It wasn't like I was planning to do anything wrong. But the nervous energy I felt as I sat there told a different story. I had spent way too long getting ready that morning, trying on different outfits, fixing my hair, putting on makeup, things I hadn't bothered with in months. I told myself it was just because I wanted to look nice, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. I wanted Mark to notice me, to see me as attractive, desirable. When he walked into the cafe, my heart skipped a beat. He looked even better in person than he did in his photos, taller, more confident, with that same easy smile I remembered from our school days. He spotted me right away and waved, making his way over to my table. "Stacy," he said, pulling me into a hug. "It's so good to see you." "You too," I said, trying to sound casual, though my pulse was racing. We sat down, and for the next hour, we talked and laughed like old friends, reminiscing about high school, catching up on each other's lives. But there was something more beneath the surface, a tension, a spark that I couldn't ignore. Every time his eyes met mine, I felt it, and I knew he felt it too. After our coffee, we stood outside the cafe, lingering awkwardly as though neither of us wanted to leave just yet. He looked at me, his smile fading a little as his expression grew more serious. "I've really missed this, Stacy. Talking to you. It feels easy." I nodded, my throat tight. "Yeah, it does." He hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer. "Maybe we could do this again sometime?" The words hung in the air between us, loaded with unspoken meaning. I knew what he was really asking, and I knew that if I agreed, things would change. This wasn't just about coffee anymore. This was about crossing a line I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. But something inside me, the part that had been craving excitement, passion, something pushed me to say, "I'd like that." Mark and I started meeting regularly after that. At first, it was just coffee, just catching up like old friends. But each time we met, the tension between us grew stronger, harder to ignore. I found myself looking forward to our meetups more than I should have, thinking about him in a way I hadn't thought about anyone in years. George, as usual, didn't seem to notice. He was busy with work, with his own routine, and I told myself that what I was doing wasn't really wrong. After all, nothing had happened. Not yet, anyway. But deep down, I knew that something was building between Mark and me, something that couldn't be ignored forever. One afternoon, after one of our coffee meetups, Mark suggested we go for a walk in the park. It was a beautiful day, and I agreed, happy to spend more time with him. As we walked along the tree-lined paths, talking and laughing, I felt a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years. With Mark, I could be myself. I didn't have to pretend, didn't have to hide the parts of me that felt lost and unfulfilled in my marriage. We found a bench under a large oak tree and sat down, enjoying the quiet of the park. Mark turned to me, his expression serious. "Stacy, can I be honest with you?" I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "I've really enjoyed spending time with you these past few weeks. It's been amazing, but I can't pretend that I don't feel something more. I think about you all the time. I want to be with you, Stacy." His words hit me like a wave, crashing over me with the force of everything I had been trying to ignore. I had known, deep down, that this was coming, but hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way I wasn't prepared for. "Mark," I started, but he interrupted me. "I know you're married, and I don't want to mess up your life, but I can't help how I feel. I just needed to tell you." I stared at him, my mind racing. This was it, the moment of truth. I could either walk away, end this before it went any further, or I could give in to the temptation that had been pulling at me for weeks. And then, without thinking, I leaned in and kissed him. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as though we were both testing the waters. But then, something inside me broke free, and I kissed him harder, with a hunger I hadn't felt in years. He pulled me closer, his hands on my back, and for a moment, the world around us disappeared. When we finally pulled apart, I was breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. I had crossed the line, and there was no going back. "I've wanted to do that for a long time," Mark said, his voice low and husky. I smiled, still catching my breath. "Me too." We sat there for a while, holding hands, neither of us saying anything. The weight of what had just happened hung heavy in the air between us, but I didn't regret it. For the first time in a long time, I felt alive. After that day in the park, things between Mark and me escalated quickly. We started meeting more often, sneaking around like teenagers, trying to keep our affair a secret. It was thrilling and terrifying at the same time. Every time we met, I told myself it would be the last, but then I would find myself texting him, setting up another rendezvous. We started meeting in hotels, where we could be alone without the risk of running into someone we knew. Each time I walked into a hotel room with him, my heart raced with a mix of excitement and guilt. But once we were behind closed doors, all those feelings disappeared, replaced by the heat of our passion. Mark made me feel things I hadn't felt in years. With him, I wasn't just Stacy, the suburban housewife. I was desired, wanted, alive. He made me feel beautiful, powerful, like I was the only woman in the world who mattered. But the guilt was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was betraying George in the worst way possible. Every time I came home after being with Mark, I would feel sick with guilt, but I couldn't stop. I was in too deep. One evening, after a particularly passionate afternoon with Mark, I came home to find George sitting in the living room, his face unusually serious. He looked up at me as I walked in, and there was something in his eyes that made my stomach drop. "Stacy, we need to talk," he said, his voice low and controlled. I froze, my heart racing. He knew. Somehow he knew. "What is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but inside I was panicking. He gestured to the couch, and I sat down, my hands trembling in my lap. George sat across from me, his expression unreadable. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he began, his voice calm but with an edge of tension. "About us. About our marriage." I swallowed hard, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "We haven't been connecting for a long time," he continued. "I know I've been distant, and I'm sorry for that. But I can't shake the feeling that there's something going on with you. You've been different lately. Distant. And I need to know if there's something you're not telling me." My heart pounded in my chest. This was it. The moment of truth. I had two options. I could come clean and admit everything, or I could lie and hope he would believe me. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The guilt, the shame, the weight of everything I had been hiding, it all came crashing down on me at once. I started, my voice shaking. "I've been seeing someone." George's face went pale, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. Then, slowly, he nodded, as though he had been expecting it all along. "Who is it?" he asked, his voice strained. I hesitated, but there was no point in lying anymore. "His name is Mark. We went to high school together." George stared at me, his expression a mix of shock and betrayal. "How long?" "Just a few months," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He stood up, running a hand through his hair, pacing the room. "I can't believe this," he muttered. I thought we were okay." Tears welled up in my eyes as I watched him. "I'm sorry, George. I never meant for this to happen." I just felt so lost. So disconnected. He stopped pacing and turned to face me, his eyes filled with hurt. "So this is my fault?" "No," I said quickly. "It's not your fault. It's mine. I should have talked to you. I should have." George held up a hand, cutting me off. "I need some time to think about this." He walked out of the room, leaving me sitting on the couch, my heart shattered into a million pieces. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. George didn't speak to me, didn't even look at me. He slept in the guest room, and the silence between us was suffocating. I didn't know if our marriage could survive this, and part of me wasn't even sure if I wanted it to. I stopped seeing Mark. After my confession to George, I knew I couldn't continue the affair. It had been a temporary escape, but now it felt like a prison. I told Mark it was over, and though he was disappointed, he understood. But even with the affair over, the damage had been done. George and I were broken, and I didn't know if we could ever be fixed. One night, after days of silence, George finally came to me. "We need to decide what we're going to do," he said, his voice heavy with sadness. I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. "I know." He sat down next to me, and for the first time in weeks, he took my hand. "I don't want to lose you, Stacy," he said, his voice breaking. "But I don't know if I can forgive you." Tears filled my eyes as I looked at him, the weight of my betrayal crushing me. "I don't expect you to forgive me," I whispered, "but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this. If you'll let me." When George left the room that night, I thought that was the end. The silence between us after my confession felt like a deep, bottomless pit, an emptiness that couldn't be filled no matter what I said or did. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew one thing for sure: my marriage would never be the same again. But George didn't leave right away. He stayed, though it was clear he was there only in body, not in spirit. Every word exchanged between us was cold and distant, as if we were strangers living in the same house. I spent most of my time in our bedroom, too ashamed to even look at him. I felt the weight of my mistake pressing down on me every minute of every day. But even more, I felt the sharp sting of the betrayal I had committed. I had been the one to destroy the trust in our marriage, and now I was paying for it. For days, George kept to himself. He slept in the guest room, came and went from work without saying more than a few words to me. The distance between us grew thicker, and I began to lose hope that we could ever get back to how things were. I had already ended things with Mark, but that didn't seem to matter. The damage was done, and George's silence was my punishment. One evening, George came home from work a little later than usual. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of cold tea, when I heard him walk in. I braced myself, expecting more of the same coldness, but this time was different. There was something off about him. The way he moved, the look on his face, it made my skin prickle with unease. He walked into the kitchen, dropped his keys on the counter, and then, for the first time in weeks, he looked directly at me. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made me feel like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting to fall. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low, almost too calm. I swallowed hard, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. "About what?" "About us. About what you did. About what I want." His words sent a chill down my spine. I opened my mouth to speak, to apologize again, to beg for forgiveness, but he held up a hand, stopping me. "Don't," he said, shaking his head. "Don't say anything. Not yet." I closed my mouth and waited, my heart pounding in my chest. He pulled out a chair across from me and sat down, resting his elbows on the table, his eyes never leaving mine. "I've had time to think," he said, "and I've come to a decision." I felt my throat tighten. "What decision?" George leaned back in his chair, his expression still calm, but there was an undercurrent of something darker in his eyes. "I'm not leaving," he said, "but things are going to change." I blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, leaning forward again, his voice cold and deliberate, "that I'm not just going to let this go. You cheated on me, Stacy. You betrayed me. And I'm not going to pretend like that didn't happen. But instead of walking away, I've decided to stay. And you're going to make up for what you did." His words hung in the air between us, heavy and threatening. My stomach churned with a mix of fear and confusion. "George, I said don't speak," he interrupted, his voice sharp. "You don't get to talk right now. You don't get to apologize anymore. I don't want your apologies." I stared at him, my mind racing. This wasn't the George the first knew. He had never spoken to me like this before, with such coldness, such detachment. It was like he had become someone else. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. George's lips curled into a small, bitter smile. "I want you to feel what I felt. I want you to know what it's like to be hurt, to be humiliated." My heart sank. "George, please. Do you remember what you told me the night you confessed?" he asked, cutting me off. "You said you felt lost, disconnected, like you weren't alive anymore." I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. "Well," he said, leaning back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. I think it's time we fix that. I think it's time you start feeling alive again, Stacy. But this time, it's going to be on my terms. I didn't understand what he was getting at, but the way he was looking at me, the cold, calculating way, made my skin crawl. I wanted to say something, to ask what he meant, but I was too afraid of what his answer would be. You're going to make things right, George continued. And you're going to do it by doing exactly what I say. No more lies. No more secrets. If you want to fix this, if you want me to stay, then you're going to have to prove it. And it's not going to be easy. The knot in my stomach tightened. I had expected anger, expected shouting, or even threats of divorce. But this cold, controlled revenge was something I hadn't anticipated. I had never seen the side of George before, and it terrified me. What do you want me to do? I asked, my voice shaking. George stood up, walked over to me, and leaned down so that his face was just inches from mine. You're going to do whatever I tell you to do, he said softly. No questions. No complaints. You owe me that much. I nodded, my heart racing. I didn't know what he had planned, but I was too scared to argue. The next few days passed in a haze of anxiety and dread. George didn't say much, but there was an air of anticipation around him that made me feel like I was constantly on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. He had made it clear that he wasn't done with me yet, but he hadn't given me any details. I tried to go about my daily routine, but everything fell off. I couldn't focus on anything, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every time I looked at George, I saw that same cold, calculating expression, and it sent shivers down my spine. Then, one evening, George came home from work and told me to get dressed. Where are we going? I asked, my heart pounding. You'll see, he said, his voice calm but firm. Just do as I say. I didn't argue. I went upstairs, changed into a simple dress, and came back down to find him waiting by the door. He didn't say anything as we left the house, and the silence between us was suffocating. We drove for about 15 minutes before George pulled into the parking lot of a small, upscale restaurant. I recognized it immediately. It was one of our favorite places to go when we first got married, back when things were still good between us. Why are we here? I asked, my voice trembling. George didn't answer. He got out of the car and walked around to open my door. I followed him inside, my heart racing with nerves. The restaurant was dimly lit, with soft music playing in the background, and the smell of rich food filled the air. It was the kind of place that used to make me feel special, but now it only heightened my sense of dread. George led me to a small table near the back of the restaurant, away from the other diners. I sat down, feeling like my heart was about to leap out of my chest. I didn't know what was happening, but I had a sinking feeling that whatever it was, I wasn't going to like it. We ordered drinks, and for a few minutes, everything seemed normal. George made small talk, asking about my day, but there was a tension in his voice that made it clear this wasn't just a casual dinner. I sipped my wine, trying to calm my nerves, but nothing could shake the feeling that something was about to go horribly wrong. Then, just as our food arrived, George leaned across the table, his eyes locked on mine. I want you to call him, he said. I froze, staring at him in disbelief. What? Mark, he said, his voice low and cold. I want you to call him. I blinked, my heart pounding in my chest. Why? Because I want him to know that you're still thinking about him, George said, his voice sharp. I want him to know that even though you're sitting here with me, you're still thinking about him. My stomach turned. George, please. Do it, he said, cutting me off. Now. I swallowed hard, my hands shaking as I reached for my phone. I didn't understand why George was doing this, what he was trying to accomplish, but I was too scared to disobey. With trembling fingers, I pulled up Mark's number and pressed call. It rang twice before Mark's voice came through the line. Stacy? I hesitated, glancing at George, who was watching me with cold, expectant eyes. Hi, Mark, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Is everything okay? I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, my heart pounding in my chest. I just wanted to check in, I said, feeling my throat tighten. I've been thinking about you. George's lips curled into a cruel smile, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Stacy, what's going on? Mark asked, his voice filled with concern. You don't sound like yourself. I bit my lip, fighting back tears. I'm fine, I lied. I just wanted to hear your voice. George reached across the table and took my hand, squeezing it tightly. The gesture was meant to look affectionate, but the pressure of his grip was painful, a silent warning not to say anything more. I'll talk to you later, Mark, I said quickly, my voice trembling. Goodbye. I hung up the phone and set it down on the table, my hands shaking. George leaned back in his chair, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. You see, he said, his voice soft but dangerous. You're still mine, Stacy. No matter what you do, no matter who you think about, you're still mine. I stared at him, feeling a mix of fear and disgust. This wasn't about fixing our marriage. This was about control. About revenge. George wanted to hurt me the way I had hurt him, and he was going to drag me through hell to do it. The next few weeks were a nightmare. George's demands became more and more twisted. He made me call Mark again, several times, forcing me to string him along, making it seem like I was still interested. Each time, I felt sick with guilt, but I didn't know how to stop. George was in control, and I was too terrified to defy him. One evening, George came home from work with a new demand. I want you to invite him over, he said, his voice cold and emotionless. I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. What? I want you to invite Mark over, George repeated, his eyes glinting with a dark, twisted pleasure. I want him to come here. And I want to watch. My stomach turned. George, no. I can't. You will, he said, his voice firm. You owe me that. Tears filled my eyes as I shook my head. Please, George. Don't make me do this. But he wasn't listening. He had already made up his mind. The day Mark came over was one of the darkest days of my life. I had tried to warn him, tried to hint that something wasn't right, but he didn't pick up on it. When he arrived at our house, he looked happy, like he thought we were going to rekindle our affair. Little did he know that George was waiting, watching, ready to humiliate me in the worst possible way. When Mark walked through the door, I felt a wave of shame and guilt wash over me. I had let things go too far. I had hurt George, and now he was using that pain to hurt me. I had no one to blame but myself. George stood in the doorway of the living room, his arms crossed over his chest, a cruel smile on his face. Welcome, Mark, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. I'm so glad you could join us. Mark looked confused, glancing between George and me. What's going on? George walked over to me, his hand resting on my shoulder in a mockery of affection. Stacy's been telling me all about your little affair, he said, his voice cold. And I thought it would be fun for us all to get together. You know, to clear the air. Mark's face went pale. Stacy, what is he talking about? I couldn't look at him. I couldn't speak. The guilt and shame were too much. I had dragged him into this mess, and now he was going to pay for it. George's smile widened as he watched Mark's confusion turn to anger. Oh, don't worry, he said, his voice light and casual. I'm not mad. I just want to watch. I want to see the two of you together. Mark's eyes widened in shock. What the hell are you talking about? You heard me, George said, his voice cold and menacing. I want to watch you with my wife. Right here. Right now. I felt sick. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about George's need for control, for power. He wanted to degrade me, to make me feel small and worthless, and he was willing to use Mark to do it. Mark shook his head, stepping back toward the door. I'm not doing this, he said, his voice filled with disgust. I don't know what's going on, but I'm not going to be a part of it. He turned to leave, but George grabbed his arm, pulling him back. Oh, you're not going anywhere, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Not until I say so. I watched in horror as the situation spiraled out of control. Mark struggled to free himself from George's grip, but George was stronger, angrier, and he wasn't going to let him go that easily. George, stop, I cried, rushing forward to try to pull him away. Please, stop. But George was too far gone. His need for revenge, for control, had consumed him. He shoved Mark against the wall, his fists clenched, his face twisted with rage. Do you think you can just come into my house and sleep with my wife? George shouted, his voice filled with venom. Do you think you can just take what's mine? Mark raised his hands in surrender, his voice shaking. I didn't know, man. I didn't know she was married. George's eyes blazed with fury. That doesn't change anything. Before I could react, George swung his fist, hitting Mark square in the jaw. Mark stumbled back, clutching his face, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "George, stop it!" I screamed, grabbing his arm, trying to pull him away. "Please, stop." But George was relentless. He grabbed Mark by the collar, pulling him up and slamming him against the wall again. "You don't get to just walk away from this," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't get to just leave." Tears streamed down my face as I watched the man I had married turn into a monster. This wasn't the George the first knew. This wasn't the man I had loved for all those years. This was someone else, someone consumed by anger, by a need for vengeance that couldn't be satisfied. Finally, Mark managed to break free, stumbling toward the door. "I'm done," he said, his voice weak. "I'm leaving. Don't ever contact me again." And with that, he was gone, leaving George and me standing in the wreckage of our marriage. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized that I couldn't live like this anymore. George's need for revenge had destroyed whatever was left of our relationship. We weren't husband and wife anymore. We were enemies, locked in a battle of control and pain. I had made a mistake. I had hurt George in the worst way possible, and now he was hurting me in return. But I couldn't let this go on. I couldn't let him continue to degrade me, to control me, to use my guilt against me. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I packed my bags. I didn't leave a note. I didn't say goodbye. I just walked out of the house, leaving George behind. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew one thing for sure. Leaving George was like tearing off a bandage, sudden, painful, but necessary. Yet, as I stepped out of our home with nothing but a bag and my car keys, the uncertainty of it all clung to me like a shadow. I had no plan, no clear future. I was walking away from the chaos, but I didn't know what I was walking toward. I stayed in a small motel for a while, staring at the ceiling, waiting for clarity that never came. The quiet, which I thought would bring peace, only amplified the questions. Did I make the right choice? Could George and I have saved our marriage if I had stayed? Or was leaving the only way to survive the mess we had made? The days blurred together, but I eventually found a tiny apartment downtown, just a place to retreat, to figure out what was next. It was nothing special, just a small, sparse space, but for the first time, it was entirely mine. Yet, it didn't feel like a fresh start. It felt like a limbo, a pause in the chaos, but not an end to it. George called and texted, at first angry, demanding answers, then quieter, asking for a conversation. His words softened over time, turning into apologies, regret hanging in every message. But I never replied. I couldn't. Not because I hated him, no, that would have been easier. It was because I wasn't sure of anything anymore. Not sure if I could forgive him, or if he could forgive me. Not sure if what we had was worth salvaging, or if it had been doomed from the start. I tried to distract myself, found a job at a local bookstore where I could blend into the quiet hum of pages turning and soft voices chatting. But even there, surrounded by stories of new beginnings and happy endings, the uncertainty gnawed at me. Life didn't follow the clean arcs of a novel. My story had no clear resolution, no neat conclusion. One evening, after another long day at work, I sat by the window of my small apartment, staring at the darkened sky outside. The phone buzzed beside me, another message from George. I hadn't blocked him. Part of me couldn't. Maybe I was still waiting, hoping for some sign, some certainty, that I hadn't found yet. The message read, "I'm sorry, Stacy. Can we talk? I don't want to lose you." I stared at the words for what felt like hours. Part of me wanted to respond, to believe that we could fix things. But another part, worn out, tired of the cycle, couldn't find the strength to type a single word. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the decision I hadn't made yet. Was this really the end? Or was there something left worth saving? I didn't know. And maybe I wouldn't know for a long time. But for now, all I could do was sit in the silence, waiting for an answer that might never come.